Hello, everyone. We are going to wait a quick second for everyone to roll in. While that is happening, feel free to drop a note in the chat where you're dialing in from. Again, a big welcome. Hi, Max. Wonderful. Well, welcome all. My name is Maya, and I am the Program Director of Behavioral Insights Group at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm delighted to be joined by Erez, Yoeli, and Moshe Hoffman. They're here today to tell us a little bit about their book, Hidden Games, The Surprising Power of Game Theory to Explain Irrational Human Behavior. And I will introduce them briefly before I hand the mic to Erez. Erez Yoeli is a research scientist at MIT's Sloan School of Management, the director of MIT's Applied Cooperation Team, and the lecturer at Harvard's Department of Economics. His research focuses on altruism. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Moshe Hoffman is a research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology, a research fellow at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and a lecturer at Harvard's Department of Economics. His research focuses on game theory. He lives in Lübeck, Germany. With that, welcome again. And Erez, I'm passing the mic to you now.
Hi, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Maya and Todd and everybody else who helped organize this. Today, I'll talk briefly about the book and also make some comments as to why we think this is particularly relevant for a behavioral audience. And then we'll open the floor up for questions, as Maya said. Hidden Games is a book that tries to use game theory to answer, to address puzzles in a variety of domains, puzzling human behaviors and intuitions and emotions, tastes, beliefs, ranging from our sense of rights and beauty to our sense of ethics and altruism and justice. And what I'll do today is I'll actually focus in on one of these, on our sense of justice, give you a sense of the kinds of puzzles we explain using game theory, show you our very simple game theory explanation for those puzzles, then zoom back out and tell you a bit more about what to expect from the book, and as I mentioned earlier, why we think it might be particularly interesting to a behavioral audience. All right, so with that, let me go ahead and start by introducing some puzzles related to our sense of justice. This first one is represented by the Hatfield clan of the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud. And the puzzle is, why do folks like the Hatfields feel this unstoppable drive to vengeance? Why is it the case that when they're wronged, they can't just stop themselves and say, wait, let's let the bygones be bygone and not respond to this wrong? And by doing so, maybe prevent the cycle of violence from escalating, which obviously, if you know the history of the Hatfield and McCoy feud, very much did not happen. It also doesn't happen in many international disputes. If you follow the dispute between Israel and Gaza, for instance, so a lot of times the way that this gets out of hand is very similar. So our question here is, why not let the bygones be bygone? Why can't we do that? So that's one puzzle. Here's a second puzzle related to our sense of justice. This one is a screenshot from the movie Donnie Brasco, and it's a real story about a gangster, Sonny Napolitano, who befriended an FBI agent. And after this was discovered, Sonny Napolitano was killed. Now, there was never any doubt that Sonny Napolitano was a loyal gangster. It was very clear to his bosses that he had made a mistake in befriending the FBI agent, and yet he was nonetheless punished for this. And so the puzzle that this raises is, why do we punish accidental transgressions? Why not just punish people when they transgress intentionally and leave the accidental ones unpunished? Puzzle number 3 related to a sense of justice. This one's represented by the Falkland Islands War. In that war, if you remember that history, England defended the Falkland Islands, which is a territory they've had for over a century, about 2 centuries. And they defended that island despite the fact that, in fact, they didn't really want the territory anymore. For decades, they had been trying to offload it. But when Argentina attacked it, England went ahead and defended the Falkland Islands with a full-scale military force. And this cost them hundreds of lives, it cost them billions of dollars. And the question this raises is, why would one respond to even a trivial transgression with such a full-blown response? So that's our third puzzle related to our sense of justice. Now, some people might say that, and give an answer to these kinds of puzzles by saying, well, maybe our sense of justice, it developed a long time ago, and now it's in this context, this new modern context with guns and missiles and stuff. And it really didn't develop for that. It developed in the savannah, and it's not so well attuned for modern settings. Or they might say maybe we're just driven by emotions, or we developed a taste for vengeance, and they might kind of stop at that. And what we're going to do is not stop at that, and instead we're going to try to dig down deeper and see if we can't uncover some hidden logic behind these kinds of seemingly irrational behaviors. And as you guys have already guessed, we're going to do that with some game theory. The logic to this particular explanation that we're going to give right now with game theory has 3 parts. The first part is something that any pet owner or any parent would already have thought of, and that's that if you're going to try to deter transgressions, then a good way to do that is to threaten to punish. Like, for instance, by spraying your cat every time that they scratch the couch. The way that we might model this using a simple game theory model, if you look at the game in front of you, this is a classic game tree for those familiar with this. You read it from the top to the bottom. The circles represent decision nodes. The number represents the player that makes the decision. So this is a game with 2 players. Player 1 goes first, then player 2 moves. Player 1 goes first and decides whether to transgress or not to transgress. Player 2 then decides whether to punish or not. And you can do that regardless of whether or not player 2 transgressed. That's why you see that decision, the same decision between punishment and not on both sides. Down below, what we've done is represented with just numbers here, player 1's payoffs. And what you can see if you look on the left is that if player 1 transgresses, those payoffs are higher than on the right, where if player 1 doesn't transgress. So transgressions benefit player 1 in some way. The cat likes scratching the couch. However, the cat doesn't like being punished. It doesn't like being sprayed. And so there is a reduction in the payoffs from being punished. You go from 2 to -1 or from 0 to -3. The second step in the logic, and I should say that if, of course, if the cat assumes that it's going to get punished for scratching the couch, then it compares the number -1 to 0 over here, down here on the bottom left versus the bottom right. And it says, well, actually -1 is worse than 0 since I assume I'm going to be punished in one case, but not the other. And it decides it's not going to scratch the couch. So the threat of punishment deters transgressions in this little game. The second step in this logic, though, is that threats must be credible. And that's sometimes a problem because while spraying a cat is not so costly to us, many punishments really are. Think about the Hatfields and McCoys that we mentioned earlier. Every time the Hatfields decide they're going to punish the McCoys for a wrong, they're sticking their necks out. The McCoys will shoot back. And similarly, we're experiencing that right now with Russian sanctions. And while the sanctions hurt Russia, they also hurt us every time that we go to the pump or go to buy something and prices are higher. And so something needs to be there to make that threat credible, to make people willing to pay that cost to punish. And what could that thing be? And that's the third. Before I do that, how would we see that in the game? Well, to see that, we obviously have to add payoffs to player 2, the player punishing. And so I've done that at the bottom. You can see that 2, -1, player 1's payoffs go first, player 2 second, naturally. And you can see here that when player 2 decides to punish, the payoff is lower for player 2. -1 is lower, is greater than -3. -2 is lower than 0. Each time on both of those sides, the payoffs are lower for punishing. However, of course, player 2 does prefer a world where player 1 does not transgress. The payoffs on the right are higher than the payoffs on the left. So that's how we would formalize something like that. All right. The final piece to the logic, the third and final piece to the logic, is the answer to the question of what would make the punishment credible. And the answer is that there has to be something in the future that makes it that if you fail to punish now, then it changes the expectations over whether you'll punish in the future. And thus, of course, you'll be more likely to be punished in the future. So not punishing now changes the expectation in the future. And this is exactly what Wilt Chamberlain got wrong when it came to appeasement of Hitler. Chamberlain looked at the situation and hoped that Hitler would be appeased with Czechoslovakia, but of course what he did was change the expectations over whether Hitler would be punished for invading Poland. And Hitler went ahead and did that, and the rest is history. How would we model this? Well, we'd have to complicate the model a little bit. And the way we typically do that is we would add a repeated element. We would play the game once, then with some probability represented here by delta, we would play the game again. And then we would notice that what really needs to be the case is that if players don't punish a transgression, indicated here in red, then it needs to be the case that they expect that future transgressions also would be less likely to be punished, indicated on the right in red. And then, of course, there will be more likely to be more transgressions. So there you go. Got to see a little bit of game theory too. All right, so how does that help us understand those three puzzles we posed earlier about our sense of justice? First of all, let's return to the Hatfields and McCoys. Remember, the puzzle here is, why can't we let bygones be bygones? Why can't we just let things go? Why can't we squash that cycle of violence from spiraling out of control? And the answer here is that bygones are not actually bygone in these kind of settings. The fact that you fail to punish now, to punish a transgression, changes the expectations in the future. So, treating these, there we go. Treating these bygones as bygone is actually the mistake. We can't do that. We have to recognize the fact that failing to punish a transgression actually has implications for expectations down the line over whether or not future transgressions will be punished. And that means that kind of seeing it this way, this framing of letting bygones be bygones, is actually the problem. And the advice that people tend to give of letting things go might actually not be the best advice. What about our second puzzle, the puzzle with Sonny Napolitano, and the question being, why do we punish transgressions even if they're accidental? Well, here, the point is, it doesn't matter if you know that Sonny didn't mean to transgress. What you care about is that other people know that you will punish future transgressions. And so if you're not so confident that they know that Sonny did this by accident, then you're not going to risk it, and you're just going to punish Sonny so that they are absolutely sure that you will punish future transgressions. And so that kind of logic, that in these kinds of settings, you don't care only about what you know, but you care about what other people know, a concept known in game theory as higher order beliefs, is also going to play a role in this kind of setting. What about the third one? The third puzzle related to the Falkland Islands and the idea that one will respond with a full-blown reaction even to very minor transgressions. Well, here again, the logic is the same. It's really not about what you know. It's not about the fact that you know the Falkland Islands are useless to you and you'd rather get rid of them. It's about the fact that you need to make sure that other people know you will punish transgressions against you in the future, including the ones that are valuable to you, like an important military base or like England. And so again, it's not about the Falkland Islands. Those lives and those dollars were not about the Falkland Islands. They were about deterring future incursions into valued territories. In the chapters in the books, what we typically will do at this point is also explain some additional puzzles using the same model. The idea being, if the model can parsimoniously explain lots of stuff, it makes you believe it a bit more. In this particular chapter, we go into where feuds might have come from and why anybody would ever challenge somebody to a feud. Why risk your neck in order to do that? We also talk about apologies. When do apologies need to be costly? When is it okay to just say, I'm sorry? Costly being represented here by the roses, because you go ahead and buy flowers. I won't go into the answers right now, but if you're curious, you can pick up the book and find them there. What I do want to do now is zoom back out and talk a little bit more about what you can expect from the book. First of all, what is game theory? What is it doing? I think in short, what game theory is a math toolkit that allows you to tackle situations where people's motivations are intertwined, like in the setting that we just saw. For player one, whether or not it's worth transgressing depends on how player two is going to respond. Are they going to punish me for transgressing or not? For player two, whether it's worth punishing or not depends on how player one responds. Is he going to be more likely to punish again in the future? And game theory is a toolkit that's designed to help us understand how players will behave in these kinds of contexts. In this book, what are we applying game theory to? Well, traditionally, game theory would have been applied to things like statescraft. Nuclear brinksmanship is a classic application of game theory. Or poker games. When game theory was first being developed, it was actually one of the applications was to poker. Another application that you'll find is that of mergers. At the Department of Justice, at the Federal Trade Commission, there are literally dozens of economists who use game theory models every single day to analyze the potential impact of a merger and decide whether we should let that merger through, and they use game theory models to do that. What about auctions? Another classic application of game theory. Game theory can help you understand how the different rules for auctions will influence how players bid and how what revenues to expect from those auctions, and so on and so forth. So those are classic applications of game theory, but we're obviously not so focused on those applications. Instead, we're focused on things that are more intuitive, more emotional, people's tastes, people's beliefs. The question that might be rising to your mind is, or coming to mind, is why on earth would that even be relevant? Why is game theory a good toolkit for these kinds of questions? Well, game theory is going to be relevant anytime there is optimization going on. And one way you can get optimization is through people sitting around thinking very hard about what the optimal thing is to do in a given context. And obviously, especially this audience will be aware that there might be problems with how good they are at optimizing in these contexts. But regardless, that is at least one way one gets optimization. And sometimes even teams of people will sit around, they collect lots of good information, they do all the necessary calculations, blah, 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 and then make decisions this way. Think about the Federal Trade Commission and its teams of economists sitting around thinking about whether to allow the merger to go through. However, this is not the only way one can get optimization. Another way that we get optimization is through biological evolution. And that can explain why game theory has been successfully applied to a wide range of questions in animal behavior for about the last 50 years. These include animal territoriality, as represented by this little gentleman over here on the left. Peacock's long, ostentatious, beautiful tails. Where do those come from? A classic puzzle in biology that even bothered Darwin was finally solved with the help of a little game theory in the 1980s. Cooperation between non-kin, here represented by these two cute little vampire bats that are sharing blood. One of the bats has been unsuccessful in his hunts, and the other one is helping him out and preventing him from starving. And so game theory has been used for these kinds of things. In our book, we're going to rely maybe some of the time on biological evolution, but a lot of the time what we're going to rely on actually is cultural evolution. The idea here being that people's tastes and beliefs are being optimized, but the way that they're being optimized is that people learn from their own experience, that they maybe learn by looking at what other successful people are doing, but what lots of other people are doing, and so on. That kind of a way of shaping, that kind of way of optimizing is also one that's often been used to explain a variety of puzzles. For instance, how we can build homes that keep people warm in the Arctic tundra with just snow around, or why we eat spicy foods, why we develop a taste for foods that are heavily spiced. Why we nixtamalize corn by throwing ash or lime into the corn as it's cooking. Where our food taboos come from. What kind of customs arise in order to help us to maintain public goods, like the canals that allow for verdant valleys in otherwise harsh locations. And also our intuitions around marriage, specifically the idea that one shouldn't marry one's cousin. Another idea that's been tackled using cultural evolution. And so if we had to, in a nutshell, summarize the thesis of the book, it would be the thing that you see in front of you. It's that game theory applies to these questions, to these new set of puzzles that we're trying to use it for, because these are optimized by biological and cultural evolution. One implication of this is that the game shaping our intuitions and tastes and beliefs, that game is often hidden, hence the title of the book. When cultural evolution folks apply cultural evolutionary arguments to things like where our tastes for spicy foods or nixtamalized corn, or where those food taboos come from, or our intuitions around cousin marriage come from, they don't have any expectations that people will actually know the explanation that they end up providing. For instance, Joe Henrich has a paper in which he actually asks people, where do your food taboos come from? And they say, and these are food taboos related to pregnancy and breastfeeding, and they say, we can't eat these foods because if we do, our kids will end up smelling like fish. And that's obviously not the right explanation. The real explanation is that if they eat those foods, they're increasing the risk to the baby from poisoning from certain toxins. Similarly, when it comes to cousin marriage, most of us think that the reason why cousin marriage is taboo is because there are it increases the risk of genetic abnormalities. But in fact, clans have used cousin marriage to strengthen the clans for thousands of years, and they do this without increasing the risk of genetic abnormalities all that much. Really, the origin of these taboos is with the Catholic Church, starting around, say, 500, 600 AD. Another argument that we're stealing from Joe Henrich. Bottom line, though, is, as you can kind of see from the fact that we even don't know where our own intuitions around cousin marriage come from, is there's no sense in which we need to have access to the true explanation, to the true underlying game that's going on. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as you're reading through the book. All right, one last point about the book, what other puzzles to expect. We cover things related to our sense of altruism, like why do people give, but also give in kind of funny ways. Think about the charity Habitat for Humanity. What it does is it flies people who have never held a hammer in their entire life all the way across the world in order to build houses when they could have used that money to hire local labor for much less and built more houses. Now, they're doing a good thing, but they're doing it this highly ineffective way. Why would our sense of altruism make that feel like a compelling way to do good? Another question is, why is it the case that CNN and Fox are engaged in showing people just the things that are really good for their side, and everybody kind of knows that they do this, and they continue to do this? And in general, why do political debates kind of have these kinds of quirks, and why do we tend to have this kind of motivated reasoning that goes alongside of it? What are the features of motivated reasoning that one might expect, and where do those come from? Another set of puzzles we tackle in the book are classic puzzles from moral psychology, like the omission-commission distinction. This is the kind of stuff that you would see in trolley problem, illustrated through trolley problems. We tackle this using some ideas from game theory around higher order beliefs, the concept I mentioned earlier. And then we also look at things related to our sense of aesthetics, like why entire art forms will arise around artificial constraints, like hip hop does around the idea that one should rhyme one's words in very complex ways. All right, so that's the book in a nutshell, and I want to take just 5 minutes to talk a little bit about some of the implications for this particular audience. I want to talk about two implications, one for behavioral scientists in general, and then maybe also some for people engaged actively in nudging. For behavioral scientists in general, we think kind of one major thing to keep in mind is that there's this alternative explanation we're giving to the one of that maybe is most often given, which is the one related to heuristics and biases, the idea that sometimes there's some sort of cognitive limitation going on, or that maybe our psychology developed in one context and is now like being applied in this other context that it didn't develop for. And we're really, at least in some cases, offering an alternative explanation for that. You might have heard me allude to that explanation earlier when I put up this slide and suggested that our sense of justice have maybe evolved on the savannah. Some additional places where this will show up, for instance, is when talking about altruism. When we think about warm glow, some folks have suggested that the reason why we attend to whether or not we give and not the level of the public good is because one is much easier than the other, and so we can do this and not the other one. We're going to give a different explanation that has to do with the fact that this is about reputation management, and given that this is about reputation management and norm enforcement and norm compliance and so on, the idea that you give is a thing that's really important. In these kinds of cases, I have like a fair amount of confidence in our explanation. There's a lot of evidence over the I guess decades now that's consistent with a reputation-based story. And there's also even some evidence in some contexts that cognitive constraints don't really apply. For instance, our colleague Bethany Burham has this really nice paper in which she takes a classic result from the behavioral literature in which people don't respond to matches when giving to charities, and shows that if you make folks make a comparable decision, but in which they are the beneficiary or their kin are the beneficiary, settings in which norm enforcement and so on and reputations don't matter as much, then in those settings, they're suddenly very responsive to exactly the same kind of match setup. Sometimes I'm maybe a little bit less confident that our story is the right one, and maybe it's the case that both stories are going on. For instance, we referenced this Fox News stuff. There's some great evidence from our colleague Dave Rand, who has shown that cognitive constraints play a very important role in the sharing of fake news. I think they've amassed a really convincing body of evidence around that. And the claim here isn't that the explanations we're giving are competing in some sense, but they help you explain some additional things. And in the chapters, we'll focus on the additional things that the game theoretic, the hidden game, will explain. All right, a second implication for this audience, and specifically for nudging, is that I think that this approach can, in some cases, really help to narrow your search for effective nudges and to understand better which nudges are going to work really well together. This is something we've done in particular around nudges for promoting pro-social behavior. We've kind of put together this checklist that says, hey, if you go through these 3 things and build your interventions around that, you're kind of covering your bases. And that both, if you're familiar with this literature, there are dozens and dozens of these nudges. Where do you even start? But now you have a much more constrained set of nudges to look at. And also, the claim is that these nudges will work particularly well together. For instance, increasing observability and eliminating plausible deniability. These are only nudges that will work effectively, or at least they'll work more effectively if one has also communicated that this is a setting that one is expected to do some sort of good deed. In addition to that, and that's something that we've both used ourselves a lot in designing interventions, and it's something that we emphasize when we communicate to the general public. We've got a TEDx talk on this that you guys can find, as well as some writing around that TEDx talk in the Behavioral Scientist that kind of places that within the larger context. And then in addition to that point, I'll also emphasize that there's this debate within the literature on will nudges actually persist, and having a bit of a theoretical framework for where these nudges can come from and why they're working in the first place can, in some cases, help you predict that. I've put up some of the papers that have tried to address this question and do so in an empirical way. And I think that this kind of theoretical framework can often complement that effort. And I think I'll stop there. I'll just give you guys some information about how to find us in case you're interested in engaging with us on social, and I'll open things up to questions, which I think Mo has been attending to all along.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erez. And Moshe has been answering a lot of questions in the Q&A. And Moshe, you're muted. Okay, great. We could potentially bring you Professor Bazerman if you would like to directly talk to Erez and Moshe. And also for Professor Zackhauser. Otherwise, Moshe, I'll let you maybe give some context to the questions you've been answering in the Q&A box.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm more than happy to just repeat some of the questions and my responses, but it might be better to hear it from, excuse the expression, the horse's mouth. I think that's the expression. Yeah, great. Hi, Max. Thanks for coming.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, and thanks for coming and for your thought-provoking questions.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for a really interesting talk. So I'm very convinced by your talk that you're giving us a conceivable reason why we see what we think of as bizarre behaviors. But I kind of get nervous that you're saying, here's an alternative rational model that can explain why Israel and Palestine can't reach an accord. I'm left with the view that there is irrationality, and we need to overcome that irrationality if we hope to solve that problem. And Professor Zeckhauser wisely brought up kind of the fact that these aren't monolithic actors, and I think that applies to Palestine, Israel as well, where there are minorities within the two factions that have done a phenomenal job at continuing a feud where most of the people would prefer an agreement. So I'm a little bit concerned that you're justifying unfortunate behavior that we really want to.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Matt. Do you mind if I field this?
Yeah.
Or at least start. Thanks, Max. I think that's those are obviously very, very good points, and I agree that especially with such an important topic, we should be careful how we frame it. We certainly don't want to unintentionally help justify bad behavior. So caution is in order, and we appreciate you guys bringing up these things to be cautious about. Maybe another way to kind of frame what Erez was saying, is that we really think about these kind of game theory models, and Erez kind of really focused on one of them as possible explanations, as one thing to consider, as some costs and benefits that may be at play. And you're right, like we should be careful to have the humility to admit that those are just one of the things at play, and other things might be have a lot of explanatory power too, and other things may or may not for any given application be more or less relevant. And so yes, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, for instance, we certainly don't want to take the stance that everything they're doing is rational and can be explained by this, simple stylized toy model. I think the stance that we feel comfortable taking is this is an element that is worthy of considering, that is perhaps at play, that might be explaining some things that we should also be wary of if we're trying to solve the problem. We should, in addition to some of these other issues like principal agency problems, conflict of interest, behavioral motivations, we might also want to consider that there could be an important subconscious strategic element that's driving things, which would have different implications for how you want to address the problem. So to the extent that it is the problem that Richard astutely brought up, that there's some particular leaders really benefit from elongating the conflict, which we do know many conflicts are well explained by that the leaders just have their kind of own interest. I don't know, you're more likely to get elected in wartime, for instance. So they have their own private interest to maybe be more aggressive than the people want, and that's definitively true and a very plausible explanation. That would lead to a very different prescription for how you solve this problem, and prescriptions that we should consider, like reduce that conflict of interest, maybe making sure the public is aware of these conflicts, maybe making sure that the public has more of a say in whether a nation goes to war. Maybe there's many other prescriptions you would come up with, but they're kind of different prescriptions than, say, Erez and I would come up with from the focus of this game theory model. But to the extent that the game theory model might be playing a role, that might lead us to focus less on Richard's prescriptions and more on thinking about what you need to deter, what you need to set precedents, or what you need to create common knowledge. And so both explanations we would claim, and maybe Erez wasn't careful enough with his wording, both explanations are, in our opinion, plausible and worthy of considering, but we should consider both. And I think that the thing that we meant to be bringing to the table here wasn't to say don't consider other stuff, but also consider the game theory, and that might lead you to think of some other solutions at least worth trying, and maybe just to broaden a little bit from this comment and this model, which is the purpose wasn't so much of our book isn't focused on Israeli-Palestine conflict. It's not, this is one application of one model in one chapter. And so the big picture point is we think game theory can help people think through, the cost benefits that are at play that might be shaping our beliefs and preferences, and might be explaining some of our seemingly irrational behaviors, but certainly isn't explaining all of our irrational behaviors, and is only one tool that we think should be in your toolkit for explaining what people do and for coming up with prescriptions to help. So sorry for the long-winded answer.
So am I supposed to speak? So first I want to congratulate you on producing this book and this seminar. It's terrific. I want to make 2 points. One, I think frequently non-rational behavior and game theory are synergistic concepts rather than competitive concepts. Otherwise, you get more of what Max likes to worry about to go along with more of what Robert Aumann likes to worry about than you would normally think. A good example, I believe, is in a, unfortunately, highly consequential area now, where Russia is invading the Ukraine, and it's thought both that your principles are at work, but it's thought that Vladimir Putin may be non-rational, and nobody really knows what his thinking is. By the way, I would also like to observe a phenomenon that I don't think has gotten much study, which is how groups can be non-rational, at least what we would call them non-rational. For example, it may be that everybody in Russia, all the leaders of Russia, would like to do something different, but I don't want to be the first guy to inform Vladimir Putin that he's making a major mistake and things are going terribly. So we would all like to inform him, and he would even like to be informed. But there's no way that the group can reach the decision that they would actually like to take. And you could imagine that the Hatfields were stuck in this position many years ago, and no Hatfield wanted to stand up to say that this is really crazy, let's do something else. So not necessarily agency theory, not necessarily group decision theory, not necessarily establishing threats for the future. It's this, complicated interweaving. And I at least hope that the Behavioral Insights group, which is a group, does something to look more at how groups behave non-rationally. And I want to congratulate you on another notion, which is you sort of say, well, this is one thing, one arrow you should have in your quiver, but you should have others, which is very different from what we usually do as academics, which is I say, I have my theory. My theory does better than your theory. And the answer is that's important if we're trying to understand why the Earth goes around the sun. But human behavior seems to be a little more complex than that, and more than one theory applies.
E, do you want me to respond again? You have something?
I basically just agree with that. So you should feel free.
Yeah, I do too. And I don't know, did Max want to jump in again, or is it okay if I say something else?
Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I obviously very much agree with all the things that Richard just said. Thanks for joining too, Dave. I was trying to read through your question, Dave, but I got distracted by this combo, but so hopefully you'll be able to recite it in a second. Yeah, I very much agree with all the points that Richard just mentioned, including the fact that, we don't really know what's going on in Ukraine, just like I admitted to not fully knowing, obviously, all the dynamics in Israel-Palestine. With Ukraine, it's quite reasonable to think that many people are afraid of Putin, not willing to tell him all the problems that their military faces or what would be a better strategy. And it's also quite possible that something is going off with Putin that can, that's, I guess, part of the risk of having a whole country dependent on a single decision maker is you end up with, the luck of the draw. And there might even be selection for a non-random single decision maker up there who's more likely to be crazy than the average person. So that's certainly an important factor to take into account. I guess, like I said before, and like it sounds like you appreciated, we simply think, it's also important to understand the strategic elements that might be at play. And sometimes those strategic elements might not be so obvious. And like with, understanding the behavioral perspective, it takes a little bit of digging to understand and clarify the strategic elements, and that digging should be done too. And I guess just to kind of emphasize the digging that we try to do throughout the book and in our research to kind of clarify the strategic elements, and to maybe re-emphasize one point from Erez's talk is oftentimes the strategic elements, I guess, people at the Kennedy School or the econ department are going to be very, very good at thinking about how we consciously, deliberatively think through the strategic elements, the kind of strategy that gets done in boardrooms or in situation room. But the strategic elements that we try to uncover in our book is the stuff that happens unconsciously, that happens in, through learning and evolutionary processes to shape our intuitions, our emotions, our beliefs, and our preferences. And that's often kind of harder to see. And I think as a result, ends up being missed more often in both the policy discussions, but also in the behavioral literature, which we so much admire. We think that this is kind of a piece that is maybe easier to overlook, which is why we're trying to emphasize it and highlight it in the book and the talk. Eve, were you going to add something?
No.
We also have Dave. Dave, did you want to say your question live or build on what we already said here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks for inviting me. So I've been really enjoying the book, and I really appreciate the idea of game theory as a lens to help us understand behavior that's otherwise misunderstood or difficult to understand. But my question was about the complementarity, given that game theory requires the individual, consciously or not, to be making assessments of what other people are thinking, how other people are going to respond to things. It seems like an ideal point of connection between behavioral science and game theory, where if we are systematically making errors, systematically assuming that other people are going to respond in certain ways, and we're incorrect, to introduce a course correction that helps set the game theoretic expectations in a way that the system plays out in a more positive way, for lack of a better term.
Do you mind if I keep fielding? Yeah, I like that point, Dave, and maybe just to kind of put things a little bit in context again. One of the things that Erez kind of said towards the end of his talk is that when we see behavioral phenomena, there's often many possible explanations, as like Max and Richard were bringing up during the Q&A. Depending on the explanation, you might want to pull different levers if you want to change behavior. And so kind of Erez highlighted that if you do see systematic biases, one possible explanation for that, which often makes sense, often is the best explanation, is something like the classic heuristics and biases approach, for instance, that well, there's a bias because there's some kind of cognitive limitation that's causing us to use a heuristic, and that's going to lead to kind of a systematic error. And if that is the cause of the systematic error, that should lead you to certain prescriptions to solve the problem. So I don't know, there's a lot of really good work on how and which heuristics and biases you can address. And sometimes it's hard, but sometimes, for instance, giving people kind of cognitive aids might help. And that's a solution that might work well for if the issue is a cognitive limitation, but would work less well if the systematic bias is coming from the kind of thing that Erez and I are discussing. So just to kind of reiterate the story that Erez and I are discussing, there's some kind of underlying incentive in game theoretic and strategic logic, but it's entering our decision making not directly through conscious awareness, but through kind of this subconscious process of it shaped our beliefs and preferences. And that subconscious process we usually think of as playing out through learning and evolutionary processes like cultural evolution or reinforcement learning, things like that. And so if that's the cause of this systematic bias, that there's some kind of underlying strategic motivation, underlying incentive that's shaped our beliefs and preferences, that'll lead to things like cognitive aids not really helping all that much. And so then in that case, you're going to be led to think, well, we need to redesign the incentive structure, for instance, to get rid of these principal agency issues, or to make it so that it's easier to make certain things common knowledge, or it's easier to communicate in these kinds of settings, to share information, or to get rid of some perverse incentives. And so those are very different types of solutions. And so we think it's really important, again, in addition to some, thinking through, for instance, heuristics and biases as a possible explanation, to also consider these types of explanations and, to test between them and to try and decipher which one might be more or less at play in this particular application. That will lead you to think of different prescriptions that might be more or less effective. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Erez, did you want to add anything?
You can use, just in brief, you can use the example of like fake news or biased news as a very clear example of this. You have even the folks who very much think that cognitive constraints play an important role here would never say that this is the whole story when it comes to a biased news environment, and that incentives do play an underlying role. And so maybe to make that more concrete, of course, you can use these cognitive, the nudges that are based on addressing the cognitive biases to ameliorate the problem somewhat. You're only going to get so far. There's also the incentives to take into account.
Just to tack on just a final thought there, to clarify, I guess, there I think are insights that game theory, a game theoretic analysis would yield to tell you what the problem is, but the way to overcome that problem could be behavioral. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the Becoming a Man program here at the Harris School that they're running out of the crime lab, where at-risk youth learn something that would be very much in line with what you guys are talking about, how you have to respond to transgressions to your honor, for instance. On the street, then they bring that into the classroom, or they respond too quickly and they escalate to violence too fast. Having understood the game theoretic, what the game is that they're playing better in a way that a behavioral scientist might not get at first pass, but could learn from a game theoretical approach. Having understood the game better, at that stage, behavioral interventions might be well suited to nudge people from a game that it leads to losses for everybody to a better game. Obviously, you're talking on a scale of sort of cultural evolution that takes over, might take a much longer period of time, but there might also be room for more sort of acute interventions.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. And, I guess I was presenting it as there's either this explanation or that explanation. This requires this prescription. This leads to that prescription. Yes, humans are a mess, a muddle of different causal forces. And certainly, it's never going to be either or. It's going to be a mixture. And even when the game theory is playing a role, there'll be a behavioral element. And sometimes that'll be the easiest to address. And sometimes even the game theory will come into play. You can push people around by getting them to think or cognitively represent the incentive structure is different, even if it's not. So I guess a classic study that we used to cite, and I don't know, now we're debating whether to cite again because it's still under discussion about whether it's replicable. But I'll just describe the study for people anyways, because I think it illustrates this argument whether or not the study is in fact, picking up on the truth. But let's at least for purposes of this conversation treat it as if it is. This is the classic eye spot study, which it seems to not replicate in the lab, but there's field evidence, evidence that it works well in the field still, and arguments for why it might be more effective there. But anyhow, let's imagine it is effective. So Dave, do you remember the eye spot study? Is this something you guys have come across?
You'll have to say more because iSpot isn't triggering anything.
Oh yeah, okay, good. So the idea is the game theoretic logic of why we have pro-social preferences, which Erez kind of alluded to in this talk, but actually in our book we spend several chapters on, is our pro-social preferences are one explanation, one cause of our pro-social preferences is underlying, under the surface, there's all sorts of reputational benefits to being pro-social, and reputations are going to have all sorts of game theoretic logic to them. For instance, they're going to be very sensitive to things like how observable your pro-social behavior is, what the norms are, how common knowledge it will be if you give or if you don't give, if you act good or if you don't act good. And so these game theory ideas like common knowledge, like the shadow of the future, the odds of a future interaction or other people learning of your behavior, that comes into play. And so at a strategic incentive level, things like that will matter. But the iSpot study says, look, actually, to get people to give in a dictator game, for instance, you don't actually need to have, a reputation where people watch what you do and will like improve your thanks. Erez is, maybe we'll walk through the field experiment in a second. But the basic idea is that in a dictator game, it doesn't, it's anonymous. Nobody's going to figure out what you do. It's not actually going to affect your reputation. Dictator, where you have $10 to divide between you and someone else, most people give, even if it won't affect their reputation. And this classic study showed that if you have eye spots, things like what Erez is showing on the screen, like just some image of eyes, and they could be more or less real looking, it seems to cause people to give more. And the thing that seems to replicate is actually in a setting like, I don't know, if you're in an office and you have like a box where you put money when you have to, when you pick up a donut, you put $1 in the box or something to the communal fund. It seems as though if you have an image like this, people are more likely to actually put the $1 in the box when they take the donut. Than if you have another image that's not eyes, but something else. And so the idea is that this is subconsciously signaling to you that like you're being watched, this behavior is observable, there will be reputational consequences. And so it's tapping into the game theoretic logic of be pro-social when it could have reputational effects without actually changing the incentive structure. And so it's using the logic of the underlying game, but also mixing it with some behavioral of, we can get people to imagine there's an underlying game even when there isn't. So sometimes it's really hard to actually change the incentive structure. You can use behavioral elements, and I think this is the kind of thing Dave was trying to get at, to still trick people into acting as if we've changed the strategic elements. Dave, that's the kind of thing you had in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up.
I wanted to bring up one more example of that, which is a paper that we actually did with Todd around
Todd Rogers.
Yeah, around getting out the vote. And there, the intervention was something where you plausibly were going to call somebody to find out how their experience was at the polls. But of course, the chances of somebody actually getting a call is very low, and the person calling you is someone you'll never really meet. So the reputational return there is very low, but it still triggers that same psychology that the iSpots does. And so if you just put the sentence at the top of a get out the vote letter, it has a pretty big effect. It increased the effect of already good get out the vote letters by 50%. It reduced the cost of getting out an additional vote from $70 to $40. Quite an effective intervention. It's working like the iSpots though. There's no real reputational return, even though we think the underlying cause is one could understand by thinking about that hidden game. So there is that complementarity.
So in both cases, we're kind of thinking, to get people to be more social, it helps to think through how reputations do work. But you're right, Dave, that like the intervention might be motivated by thinking through how reputations work, but you don't necessarily have to actually go through all the effort. You can use behavioral tricks to shortcut, but still be motivated by the game theoretic logic. Thanks.
We have a few more questions in the Q&A box and also in the chat. So I wonder if it builds on the conversation we already started, or if anyone from our impromptu panel wants to add anything and build on the conversation, feel free. We have 6 more minutes.
Cool. I do really like the idea, which I guess we haven't thought that hard about, of merging kind of this behavioral and this hidden games approach. So thanks so much for bringing that up, Dave. You're muted if you're.
I'm doing something I do terribly, which is trying to process questions on the fly. But I was curious about Alex Howlett's question. I can read it, but Alex, if you're there, do you want to read it?
Yeah, I can bring Alex up 1 second. Alex, if you're here, feel free to say your question. If not, we'll read it and answer. Oh, okay, you're here. Go
Okay,
ahead.
cool. Yeah, so I was left a little bit unsatisfied with kind of the argument that, well, you could just have a bunch of different explanations that are all maybe okay, or they can all be part of it or something like that. And I'm wondering more about, well, how do you know whether the game theory model is the correct one? So the question that I wrote is, it seems that if the game theory is consistent with quote unquote irrational behavior really being a manifestation of a hidden rational strategy, then you don't need any other explanation, right? So what kinds of things should lead us not to accept the game theory explanation, or how do we rule out a game theory model?
No, you want this one, you want me to take it?
Well, yeah, but I was actually gonna hope to cheat and punt and see if any of the impromptu panelists have thoughts on this, because I think it's a pretty tough question. When you have these different possible explanations, what would be a convincing case that a certain approach isn't necessary or isn't relevant? That's a lot harder than, I guess, like Alex said, saying humans are complicated and everything has insight. So yeah, it is ruling things out is non-trivial. I don't know, Max, did you have something you wanted to add?
Sure, I'll chime in. So first of all, I think your book is fascinating. But second, I don't want to leave the impression that the bias crowd doesn't think about economics or game theory. So I think that's always been a backdrop to the work of the bias crowd more broadly. But I look at sort of the same stories that you look at, whether it's the Hatfields and McCoys or the Israelis and Palestinians. And I add in the fact that they have options other than just moves. So in your game theoretic model, there's specific nodes for decisions. In most real world contexts, the parties can actually meet and talk to each other, hire an intermediary if it's dangerous to talk to each other. There's lots of things we can do to coordinate our action. And so I don't doubt that there's a reputational aspect over the long term that leads to dysfunctional behavior. But I'm nervous, quite honestly, that the presentation leads extremists to say to the main constituency, look, there's good reason why we have to attack one more time, even though there may be repercussions, when in fact there's sort of a mythical fixed pie over whose land is it. And if we don't if we use the game theoretic arguments to justify the dispute and don't move on with the things we can change, I'm concerned. I'm also concerned that we can rarely fix the pure structure, but we can more readily fix the decision-making and dispute resolution aspects that lie in the bias branch, at least according to the way I see your dichotomy. Yeah.
Well, let me just, sorry, were you going to jump in?
I have some thoughts, but you start, I'll go second.
Well, I mean, so first of all, yes, this talk should have a very, very clear disclaimer that it's missing. And we will make sure that it's there next time. And we're glad that you're pushing us on it. For us, this is one example in a book with, dozens. And I guess we didn't think through enough that if we focus on this example, it could end up getting more emphasis than maybe our degree of confidence in it deserves. And certainly if it's getting prime time, we should have the disclaimer that other things may be important in these applications, and don't misread. It's just a possible application. So thanks for pushing us on that. In terms of well, maybe I'll let Erez jump in now and say his points, because I guess I've been talking.
The one thought I had specifically around this is that I think it's, again, speaks to this complementarity between the two approaches, which is one thing that the game theoretic approach will tell you is perhaps the reason why that seemingly irrational drive to punch back is coming up. And then where you can use the behavioral approach is to say, well, maybe your intuition for the best way to punch back isn't the one that's going to end this conflict in the best way, and it's going to result in a conflict. I like, specifically for thinking about, for instance, Ukraine, my sense is that Biden has a sense that sanctions are not really about deterring Putin's invasion into Ukraine, which is kind of the point that we were making, but rather about Putin's future behavior. And that he has put together in a very cool-headed, slow, careful way, a coalition that can sanction Putin in a way that will influence Putin's expectations about what will happen in the future. I think he's been very effective about that. And in some ways, he's kind of doing the thing that we would hope one would do, and maybe programs like the one out of the Harris School do, which is he's not just responding by hitting the red button, but rather responding in ways that are consistent with this desire to alleviate the problem in the way that's least harmful. I think the game theory doesn't really tell you that. The game theory just tells you there's going to be this seemingly irrational drive to punch back. That seemingly irrational drive to punch back has some logic to it. Maybe it doesn't tell you what's the best way to address this, to try in this particular context, to try to ameliorate this particular conflict.
If I have, I don't know, if I have another minute or two to add to that, I don't know if you wanted to close us down.
No, we're on. It's all good. Go ahead.
Okay, good. So maybe I'll just add a few more points to what Erez said in response to Max, and maybe also if I have a minute, I'll come back to Alex's question. So one more thing to say is, yeah, one way to interpret what we're saying is we have a game theoretic justification for the world's bad behavior. And it's true that sometimes, like, some things that look irrational as bad behavior, and to some extent we are offering an explanation for that. And you could interpret that as saying, well, therefore we should let the bad behavior be. You know, it's a justification for the bad behavior. It's fine, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I could see why that would be that's a reasonable reaction, and we should be wary of that interpretation. But I don't think that's the only way to read what we're saying. So let me give, and then I see Richard has his hand back up, so we'll come to him in a sec. But, you know, one way to read what we're saying is, look, if we can understand the bad behavior, that might also help us think of ways to respond to it, to disincentivize it, for instance. Or to help us better address it in some other way. So take, again, the Ukraine situation. One thing I think the game theory helps us clarify is that, and Erez was kind of hinting at this, is that when we impose the sanctions, it's not necessarily meant to cause Putin to immediately change his behavior and leave Ukraine. What it's mostly meant to do is set this precedent that if you have aggressive warfare, you will be punished for it. And that strategic element is sometimes kind of lost in the discourse. And you might forget that that's so important. And actually, we think that is a crucial benefit of retaliation in this case, and that is something the game theory helps us see and might help make the world a better place if it helps deter future transgressive acts. So this is a case where understanding what could be motivating bad behavior might also help us reduce it in the future. Maybe one other response to Max's question, Max's point, is that he kind of brought up the fact that, like, well, the behavioral approach, that might be sometimes easier to address. And so you might think that if we bring up these strategic game theoretic elements, that suggest that, well, it's a problem we can't do anything about. But in fact, maybe sometimes that's the case, but sometimes it's actually really hard to get people to move on behavioral issues. And it might be easier to adjust the informational or incentive structure, the strategic elements. And so this is precisely a case where that seems to be true. If we as a country or an international community can impose sanctions, that does affect the strategic elements. And that might be a lot easier than altering Putin's psychology. Maybe not. Maybe we can address it, but not so obvious that one is necessarily easier than the other. Okay, so maybe we'll go to Richard now. Then, yeah.
Go ahead, Richard. You can unmute, or I can.
Thank you. So I hate to disagree with Max while he's not here, but since I'd be reinforcing what Moshe just said, I feel comfortable doing this. Often it's simpler to improve a decision structure than it is to engage in the types of behavioral things that so many people in this call, including me, have focused on. Let me give you one personal example, one example that's fundamental to America's way of proceeding, and one example from Ukraine. The secret ballot probably has done an extraordinary amount in promoting democracy. So we don't see whatever, I don't have to worry that Erez sees the way I'm voting when I decide to vote. At least at my school, we now use clickers in the classroom to get class responses, so we get better responses. So people just don't respond in some politically correct fashion or respond, the same way Moshe does because he's the smartest guy in the room, which we used to have. But in the Ukraine, one of the reasons that we've gotten fairly united provision of a public good, namely arming the Ukraine and raising the world's views against the Russian invasion, is because Biden, and to a much greater extent Blinken, have gone and met with other people. And it's a lot harder not to agree to support people when you're all in the same room than when you call people up, even if it's a Zoom call that gets many people together. And we're all hanging around saying, this is a threat to liberal democracy. We've got to do something about it. So Godspeed in changing decision structures. I hope that the next version has a final chapter which discusses that.
Did you want to call it a day? You want to pull some of the other questions from the chat? You want me to respond more to Alex? You call the shot.
Yes. So if there's anything else from the Q&A box or from the chat that you wanted to respond to, otherwise, I think we're going to bring the webinar to close.
I think it's probably, I will think about the questions in the chat, but I think it's probably a good place to call it a day. And if anybody in the chat wants to follow up with us, I gave our Twitter handles. Feel free to contact us there, and we can engage in more discussion there. I really appreciated this back and forth.
Yeah, this was fabulous. Yes, thank you all so much. And yeah, Erez and Moshe, thank you so much. Definitely follow us on Twitter. Let's continue this amazing conversation, and hopefully we'll bring you back again. Thank you all again, and see you soon.
Ciao.
Thanks for having us.